Okay. Welcome to Weekly Marx, 26 October. How time flies when we're having fun. Maybe I can do it right today. Alrighty. Excuse me. We're looking at Marx's economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63, the original, or we've been looking at the Dussel approach to the economic manuscripts during the week. And so I thought we'd look at the more original, the MECW at least, versions of that. And why bother doing this? Well, actually, and I hope you've sort of considered that from yesterday, that it's quite possible to look at this uh, Marx's more original, that is, this is translated, but still more original writings. Actually, this is in English, I guess. So we're looking at the production process of capital, contribution to the critique of political economy, the third chapter, capital in general, and this particular, the sole available source, that the MECW volumes 30 and 33. I think it says the sole available source here, but I think there must be an MEGA version of this in English, perhaps by now. And so regardless, and likely it was that one was translated by Ben Folks. Thank you, Ben Folks. So I think we've been looking at the difficulties arising from value. And I think did we get to the end? That's a very good question. I think we did. We looked at movements related to interest-bearing money. Thirdly, fourthly, yes, we did get to the end as far as I recall. So we will now look at exchange with labor. This is the economic manuscripts of 1863, 1861 to 63, the transformation of money into capital. That is the exchange with labor process, valorization process. In the process M-C-M, the value, a given sum of value, should be maintained and increased while it enters into circulation, i.e., it alternately takes on the forms of commodity and money. Circulation should not be a mere change of form, but should raise the magnitude of value, should add to the value already present a new value or surplus value. As capital, the value should be, as it were, raised to the second power, potentiated. So it's all sort of there in a kind of interesting way. The exchange value of the commodity is the quantity of equal social labor objectified in its use value, or the quantity of labor which has been embodied, that is, worked up in it. The magnitude of this quantity is measured by time, the labor time that is required to produce the use value, and is therefore objectified in it. Money is distinguished from the commodity solely by the form in which this objectified labor is expressed. In money, the objectified labor is expressed as social labor in general, which is therefore directly exchangeable with all other commodities in proportion as they contain the same amount of labor. In the commodity, the exchange value it contains, or the labor objectified in it, is only expressed in its price, i.e., in an equation with money. It is only expressed notionally in gold, the material of money and the measure of value. See, the idea of a notional expression is, I think, really important, even though, as we know, that in the front end of Capital, Marx uh, emphasizes gold for a variety of reasons. Both forms, however, are forms of the same magnitude of value and viewed in terms of their substance, forms of the same quantity of objectified labor. Thus, they are objectified labor in general. Now, as we have seen, money can be replaced in internal circulation both as means of purchase and of payment by tokens of value, tokens of itself. Now, this in no way alters the essence of the matter, as the token represents the same value, the same labor time as is contained in the money. So this idea, this transitivity of value, labor time, and money are all kind of there. And yes, for some people that might be problematic, but we're working at a kind of at an abstract level, as we've talked about before. And you can define, in some ways, subsumption in this similar kind of, as we've looked at before. In the movement M-C-M, and in the concept of capital in general, money is the starting point. This means nothing more than the starting point is the independent form assumed by the value contained in the commodity or by the labor contained in it. So, or by the labor contained in it. The form in which labor time is present as labor time in general, regardless of the use value in which it was originally embodied. Value, both in the form of money and of the commodity, is an objectified quantity of labor. Let me repeat that. Value, both in the form of money and of the commodity, is an objectified quantity of labor. If money is converted into a commodity or commodity into money, the value changes only its form, not its substance, which consists in its being objectified labor, nor its magnitude, nor its magnitude, whereby it is a definite quantity of objectified labor. All commodities, therefore, differ only formally from money. All commodities, therefore, differ only formally from money. Money is only a particular form of existence taken on by commodities in and for circulation. And as objectified labor, they're the same thing, that is value. The change of form, the fact that this value is present now as money, now as commodity, ought, on our assumption, to be irrelevant to capital, or if it is a prerequisite, assuming that capital in each of these forms is self-maintaining value, without which money and value in general does not become capital at all. In general, it should only be a matter of the same content changing its form. Next paragraph. The sole antithesis to objectified labor is non-objectified living labor. The one is present in space, the other in time. The one is in the past, the other in the present. The one is already embodied in a use value, the other as human activity in process, in human activity in process, is currently engaged in the process of self-objectification. The one is value, the other is value creating. If a given value is exchanged for the value creating activity, if objectified labor is exchanged for living labor, in short, if money is exchanged for labor, the possibility seems to be available that by means of this process of exchange, the existing value can be preserved or increased. Let us therefore assume that the money owner buys labor. Hence, the seller sells not a commodity, but labor. The relation cannot be explained on the basis of the relation of the circulation of commodities considered previously. This is, the explication of sort of potentiality or capacity, right? The move to labor power. Considered previously, where the only parties confronting each other are the owners of commodities. For the moment, we shall not inquire here into the conditions for this relation and simply assume it as a fact. Our money owner's sole aim in buying labor is to increase the value he possesses. The particular kind of labor he possesses is therefore a matter of indifference to him. All that is necessary is that it should be useful labor producing a particular use value, hence a specific kind of labor, for example, the labor of a linen weaver. We do not as yet know anything about the value of this labor, nor do we know how the value of labor in general is determined. Those of you who hang out in Home Depot parking lots. It is therefore clear that the magnitude of the value of a given quantity of labor cannot be changed, let alone increased, by the mere fact of its existing first in the form of money, the commodity in which the value of all of the commodities is measured, and then in any other use value. In other words, by its existing first in the form of money and then in the form of the commodity. It is impossible to conceive how a given sum of value, a definite quantity of objectified labor, should even be preserved as such via a metamorphosis of this kind. When it is in the form of money, the value of the commodity or the commodity itself, insofar as it is exchange value, a definite quantity of objectified labor exists in its immutable form. The money form is precisely the form in which the value of the commodity is maintained, conserved as value, or as a definite quantity of objectified labor. If I transform money into a commodity, I transform value from a form in which it is preserved into a form in which it is not preserved. And in the movement of buying in order to sell, value would first be transformed from its immutable form into a form in which it does not preserve itself, so that it could then be retransformed into money again, the immutable form. This transformation may or may not be successful in circulation, but the result would be that I possess the sum of value, the objectified labor in its immutable form, as a definite sum of money, both before and after the process. This is an entirely useless operation, and indeed, it runs counter to my purpose. If, however, I keep hold of the money as such, it is a hoard, the money bin. It has a use value again, and it is preserved as an exchange value only because it does not act as such. It is preserved as it were, as petrified exchange value by staying out of circulation, relating to it negatively. On the other hand, in the commodity form, the value perishes with the use value in which it is contained, since use value is a transitory thing and as such would be dissolved simply by the metabolic process of nature. And if it is really utilized as a use value, i.e. consumed, the exchange value contained in the use value perishes along with it. An increase in value means nothing other than an increase in objectified labor, but it is only through living labor that objectified labor can be preserved or increased. Value, that is, the objectified labor which exists in the form of money, could grow only by exchange with a commodity whose use value itself consisted in the ability to increase exchange value, whose consumption would be equivalent to the creation of value or the objectification of labor. No commodity has any direct use value at all for the value which is to be valorized, except insofar as its use constitutes the creation of value, insofar as it is useful for increasing value. But such use value is only possessed by living labor capacity, right? Potentiality. Yes, we've looked at that before. Value, money, can therefore only be transformed into capital through exchange with living labor capacity. Its transformation into capital requires that it be exchanged. on the one hand, for labor capacity, and on the other, for material conditions prerequisite to the objectification of labor capacity. Here is the basis for the, here the basis is, sorry, here the basis is the circulation of commodities, in which absolutely no dependency relations between the participants in exchange are presupposed apart from those given by the process of circulation itself. The exchangers are distinguished solely as buyers and sellers. Accordingly, money can only buy labor capacity to the extent that the latter, that is, capacity, is itself offered for sale as a commodity sold by its owner, the living possessor of labor capacity. The condition for this is, first of all, that the possessor of labor capacity should have the disposition of his own labor capacity, that he should be able to dispose of it as a commodity. Now, for this to be possible, he must be its proprietor. Otherwise, he could not sell it as a commodity. But a second condition, already contained in the first, is that he himself must bring his labor capacity as a commodity to the market and sell it, because he no longer has labor to sell in the form of another commodity. Another use value composed of objectified labor, that is, labor existing outside his subjectivity. Instead, the sole commodity he has to offer to sell is precisely his living labor capacity, present in his own living corporeity. Capacity is here absolutely not to be conceived as fortuna, that is fortune, but as potency. Instead of selling a commodity in which his labor is objectified, he must be compelled to sell his own labor capacity, that commodity which is specifically distinct from all other commodities, whether they exist in the commodity form or in the money form. A prerequisite for this is the objectification of his labor. These must have been lost to him, becoming instead subject in an alien will as a world of wealth, of objective wealth, confronting him in circulation as the property of the commodity owners as alien property. Later on, we shall be able to be more precise about the kind of conditions required for the realization of his labor capacity, i.e., the objective conditions for labor, labor in processu, conceived as activity realizing itself in a use value. Now, if then the condition for the transformation of money into capital is its exchange with living labor capacity, or the purchase of living labor capacity from its proprietor, money can, in general, be transformed into capital, or the money owner turn into a capitalist, only to the extent that the free worker is available on the commodity market within circulation, free, that is, insofar as he, on the one hand, has at his disposal his own labor capacity as a commodity, and on the other hand, has no other commodity at his disposal, is free, completely rid of all the objective conditions for the realization of his labor capacity, and therefore, as a mere subject, a mere personification of his own labor capacity, is a worker in the same sense as the money owner is a capitalist, and as subject and repository of objectified labor of value sticking fast to itself. This free worker, however, is evidently himself the product, the result of a prior historical development, the summation of many economic transformations, and his existence presupposes the fall of other social relations of production and a definite development of the productive forces of social labor. The same is therefore also true of the exchange between the money owner and the owner of labor capacity, between capital and labor, between capitalist and worker. The definite historical conditions associated with the relation presupposed here will emerge of themselves from the later analysis of that relation. In any case, capitalist production proceeds from the presupposition that free workers, i.e., sellers who have nothing but their own labor capacity to sell, will be found available within the sphere of circulation, that is, on the market. Thus, The formation of the capital relation demonstrates from the onset that it could only enter the picture at a definite historical stage of the economic development of society, of the social relations of production and the productive forces. The capital relation appears straight away as a historically determined economic relation, a relation that belongs to a definite historical period of economic development of social production. Money is in banks, right? We started out from the way the commodity appears on the surface of bourgeois society as the simplest economic relation, the element of bourgeois wealth. The analysis of the commodity showed that definite historical conditions were wrapped up in its existence too. For example, if the products are only produced by the producers as use values, the use value does not become a commodity. This presupposes that the relations among the members of society are historically determined. If we had pursued the question further, asking under what circumstances the products are generally produced as commodities, or under what conditions the product in its existence as commodity appears as the universal and necessary form of all products, it would have turned out that this only takes place on the basis of one particular historical mode of production, the capitalist one. But this way of looking at things would not have been relevant to the analysis of the commodity as such, for in that analysis, we were only concerned with the products, that is, the use values, to the extent that they appeared in the commodity form, and not with the question of the socioeconomic basis for the appearance of every product as a commodity. We were proceeding instead from the fact that the commodity is found to be present in bourgeois production as such, a universal elementary form of wealth. The production, and therefore the circulation of commodities, can, however, take place between different communities or between different organs of the same community, even though the major part of what is produced may be produced as use values for the producer's own personal requirements and therefore may never take on the commodity form. The circulation of money, for its part, and hence the development of the different elementary functions and forms of money, presupposes nothing more than commodity circulation itself, and crudely developed commodity circulation at that. Of course, this is also a historical prerequisite, but owing to the nature of the commodity, it may be fulfilled at very different stages of the social production process. A closer analysis of the individual forms of money, e.g., for example, the development of money as a hoard and of money as a means of payment, pointed to very different historical stages of the social production process. These are historical differences arising out of the sheer form of these different functions of money. But the mere existence of money in the form of a hoard or of means of payment was shown to be in equal degree a feature of every halfway developed stage of commodity circulation. Money is therefore not restricted to a particular period of production, being as characteristic of pre-bourgeois stages of the production process as of bourgeois production. Capital, however, steps forth from the outset as a relation which can only be the result of a definite historical process and the basis of a definite epoch in the social mode of production. Let us now look at labor capacity in itself, in its antithesis to the commodity which confronts it in the form of money, or in its antithesis to objectified labor, to value, which is personified in the money owner or capitalist, and in this person has become a will in its own right, being dash for itself, a conscious end in itself. Gold toilets, right? Anyway, labor capacity appears on the one hand as absolute poverty, in that the whole world of material wealth, as well as its general form, exchange value, confronts it as an alien commodity and alien money, whereas it is itself merely the possibility of labor available and confined within the living body of the worker or subject a possibility which is, however, utterly separated from all the objective conditions of its realization, hence, from its own reality, denuded of them and existing independently over them. To the extent that all the objective conditions for labor to come to life for its actual process, for really seeing it in motion, all the conditions for its objectification mediate between the capacity for labor, its potentiality, and actual labor. They can all be described as means of labor, that is, both the capacity and the actual labor itself, in order that labor capacity may as an independent factor come to meet the objectified labor represented by the owners of money and commodities, that it may confront the value personified by the capitalist. It must be denuded of its own means of labor and step forth in its independent shape as the worker who is obliged to offer his labor capacity as such for sale as a commodity. Since actual labor is the appropriation of nature for the satisfaction of human needs, the activity through which the metabolism between man and nature is mediated, to denude labor capacity of the means of labor, the objective conditions for the appropriation of nature through labor is to denude it also of the means of life. For as we saw earlier, the use value of commodities can quite generally be characterized as the means of life. Labor capacity denuded of the means of labor and the means of life is therefore absolute poverty as such. And the worker, as the mere personification of the labor capacity, has his needs in actuality, whereas the activity of satisfying them is only possessed by him as a non-objective capacity, that is, a possibility confined within his own subjectivity. As such, conceptually speaking, he's a pauper. He is the personification and repository of this capacity which exists for itself in isolation from its objectivity. On the other hand, since material wealth, the world of use values, exclusively consists of natural materials modified by labor, hence appropriated solely through labor, and the social form of this wealth, exchange value, is nothing but a particular social form of the objectified labor contained in the use values. And since the use value, that is the real use of labor capacity, is labor itself, i.e., the activity which mediates use values and creates exchange value, it follows that labor capacity is just as much the general possibility of material wealth and the sole source of wealth in the particular social form wealth has as exchange value. Value as objectified labor is, after all, only the objectified activity of labor capacity. Hence, if in dealing with a capital relation, one starts from the presupposition that objectified labor is preserved and increased, that value is preserved and increased by the fact that the owners of money or commodities continuously find available in circulation a section of the population who are mere personifications of labor capacity, mere workers, and therefore sell their labor capacity as a commodity, continuously offering it on the market, then the paradox, which seems to be the starting point of modern political economy, stems from the nature of the case. While on the one hand, political economy proclaims labor to be a source of wealth in both its material substance and its social form, as regards both use values and exchange values, on the other hand, it proclaims just as much the necessity for the worker to be in absolute poverty, a poverty which means nothing else than that his labor capacity is the sole remaining commodity he can sell, that he confronts objective real wealth as mere labor capacity. This contradiction is present in the fact that whether value appears in the form of the commodity or of money, it confronts labor capacity as such as a special kind of commodity. Yeah, poor Midas. A further antithesis is this. In contrast to money or value in general as objectified labor, labor capacity appears as a capacity of the living subject. The former is past labor, labor already performed. The latter is future labor, whose existence can be only the living activity, the current present activity of the living subject itself. Just as on the side of the capitalist there stands value as such, which has its social, universally valid, general existence as objectified labor in money, and for which each particular form of existence in the use value of every particular commodity only means a particular and in itself indifferent embodiment value as such being wealth in the abstract. So he is confronted in the shape of the worker as the mere personification of labor capacity by labor as such, the general possibility of wealth, value creating activity as a capacity in general. Now, whatever the particular kind of actual labor the capitalist may wish to buy, this particular kind of labor capacity only retains its validity to the extent that its use value is the objectification of labor in general, hence value creating activity in general. The capitalist who represents value as such is confronted by the worker as labor capacity, pure and simple, as worker in general, so that the antithesis between self-valorizing value, that is, self-valorizing objectified labor, and living value-creating labor capacity forms the point and the actual content of the relation. They confront each other as capital and labor, as capitalist and worker. This abstract opposition can be found, for example, in industry under the guild system, where the relation between master and journeyman is of an entirely different nature. This point, and the whole of this passage should be put in first in the section being capital and wage labor. Yes, all those notes that Marx made to himself. All righty. So we need to explain, of course, noting that there was I think, a typo in there, the valorization process. Value of labor capacity, minimum salary, or the average wage of the worker. Labor capacity is specifically distinguished as use value from the use values of all other commodities. Firstly, because it exists as a mere ability in the living body of the seller, the worker. And secondly, this is something that imprints on it an entirely characteristic difference from all other use values, because, secondly, because its use value, its actual realization as a use value, i.e., its consumption, is labor itself. Hence the substance of exchange value, because it is the creative substance of exchange value itself. Its actual using up, its consumption posits exchange value. Its specific use value is that it creates exchange value. Now, let me break here for a second and say, yes, this applies to all activity, right? Whether creative or quote unquote not creative, whether paid or unpaid. As a commodity, however, labor capacity itself possesses an exchange value. The question is how to determine this value. Insofar as a commodity is considered from the point of view of exchange value, it's always viewed as a result of the productive activity that is required for the creation of its use value. Its exchange value is equal to the quantity of labor used in working on it, personified, objectified in it. And the measure of this is labor time itself. As exchange value, commodities are distinguished from each other only quantitatively, and from the point of view of its substance, each commodity is a certain quantity of average social labor, of necessary labor time, which is required to produce and therefore also to reproduce this particular use value under the given general conditions of production. Hence, the value of labor capacity, like that of every other use value, is equal to the quantity of labor worked up in it. The labor time required to produce labor capacity under the given general conditions of production. Labor capacity exists only as an ability of the living body of the worker. Once labor capacity is presupposed as given, its production comes down to reproduction, preservation, as does the production of every living thing. The value of labor capacity, the value of labor capacity can therefore be resolved at the outset into the value of the means of subsistence needed to maintain it, i.e., to maintain the worker's life as a worker, so that having worked today, he'll be able to repeat the same process under the same conditions the next day. Secondly, before the worker has developed his labor capacity, before he is able to work, he must live. Thus, if capitalists continuously to find sellers of their own labor capacity available on the market within circulation, and this is a prerequisite for money to develop into capital for the capital dash relation to occur, that is, within circulation, it is necessary, the worker being mortal, that he should receive, apart from his own means of subsistence, enough of the means of subsistence to perpetuate the race of workers, to increase their number, or at the very least to maintain it at its given level so that the labor capacity is withdrawn from the market through unsuitability or death are replaced by fresh ones. In other words, he must receive adequate means of subsistence to nourish children until they themselves can live as workers. In order to develop a particular labor capacity, in order to modify his general nature in such a way that he's capable of performing a particular kind of labor, the worker requires practice or training, an education which itself must be paid for and is more or less expensive according to the particular kind of productive labor he's learning to do. This, therefore, also forms a part of the cost of production of labor capacity, important as the latter condition becomes when it is a matter of analyzing the differing values of individual branches of labor. Here, it is irrelevant, for we're only concerned with the general relationship between capital and labor, and therefore have in view ordinary average labor, seeing all labor as only a multiple of this average labor, the training costs of which are infinitesimally small. In any case, the training costs, the outgoings required to develop the nature of the worker so that his expertise and dexterity in a particular branch of labor are always included in the means of subsistence the worker requires to convert his children, his replacements, in turn into labor capacities. These costs form part of the means of subsistence required for the worker to reproduce himself as a worker. The value of labor capacity can therefore be resolved into the values of the means of subsistence required for the worker to maintain himself as a worker, to live as a worker, and to procreate. These values, for their part, can be resolved into the particular amount of labor time needed, the quantity of labor expended in order to create means of subsistence, or the use values necessary for the maintenance and propagation of labor capacity. The means of subsistence needed for the maintenance or reproduction of labor capacity can all be reduced to commodities, which passes more or less value as the productive power of labor varies, i.e., according to whether they require a shorter or longer labor time for their production, so that the same use values contain more or less objectified labor time. The value of the means of subsistence required for the maintenance of labor capacity therefore varies, but it is always precisely measured by the quantity of labor necessary to produce the means of subsistence needed for the maintenance and reproduction of labor capacity, or to maintain or reproduce labor capacity itself. The magnitude of the labor time required for this purpose is subject to variation, but a definite portion of labor time that is larger or smaller is always available and must be devoted to the reproduction of labor capacity. The living existence of this capacity itself is to be regarded as the objectification of that labor time. Naturally, the means of subsistence needed by the worker to live as a worker differ from one country to another and from one level of civilization to another. Natural needs themselves, for example, the need for nourishment, clothing, housing, heating, are greater or smaller according to climactic differences. Similarly, since the extent of the so-called primary requirements for life and the manner of their satisfaction depend, to a large degree, on the level of civilization of the society are themselves the product of history, the necessary means of subsistence in one country or epoch includes things not included in another. The range of these necessary means of subsistence is, however, given in a particular country and a particular period. Even the level of the value of labor rises or falls when one compares different epochs of the bourgeois period in the same country. Finally, the market price of labor capacity at one time rises above and at another falls below the level of its value. This applies to labor capacity as to all other commodities, and it is a matter of indifference here where we are proceeding from the presupposition that commodities are exchanged as equivalents or realize their value in circulation. Now, this value of commodities in general, just like the value of labor capacity, is represented in reality as their average price, arrived at by the mutual compensation of the alternately falling and rising market prices, with the result that the value of the commodities realized made manifest in these fluctuations of the market price itself. The problem of these movements in the level of the workers' needs, as also that of the rise and fall of the market price of labor capacity above or below this level, do not belong here, where the general capital relation is to be developed, but in the doctrine of the wages of labor. It will be seen in the further course of this investigation that whether one assumes the level of workers' needs to be higher or lower is completely irrelevant to the end result. The only thing of importance is that it should be viewed as given, determinate. All questions relating to it are not a given, but of variable magnitude belong to the investigation of wage labor in particular and do not touch its general relationship to capital. Incidentally, every capitalist who, for example, sets up a factory and establishes his business necessarily regards wages as given in the place where and the time when he sets himself up in business. Quote, diminish the cost of subsistence of men by diminishing the natural price of the food and clothing by which life is sustained, and wages will ultimately fall, notwithstanding the demand for laborers may very greatly increase. This is Ricardo, 1821. Ricardo again, quote, the natural price of labor is that price which is necessary to enable the laborers one with another to subsist and to perpetuate their race without either increase or diminution. The power of the laborer to support himself and his family does not depend on the quantity of money which he may receive for wages, but on the quantity of food, necessaries, and conveniences which that money can purchase. The natural price of labor, therefore, depends on the price of the food, necessaries, and conveniences. With a rise in the price of food and necessaries, the natural price of labor will rise. With a fall in their price, it will fall. Close quote, Ricardo. And the English peck, a measure of corn, equals 1/4 of a bushel. There are 8 bushels to 1/4. The standard bushel contains 2,218 1/5 cubic inches and measures 19.5 inches in diameter and 8 1/4 inches deep. Quote, from a comparative view of corn prices and wages from the reign of Edward III onward, we may draw the inference that during the course of 500 years, the earnings of a day's labor in this country have been more frequently below than above a peck of wheat corn. That 1 peck of wheat may be considered as something like a middle point, or a point rather above the middle, about which the corn wages of labor, varying according to demand and supply, have oscillated. That's Malthus, 1836. Now, if a lower grade commodity is put in the place of a higher and more valuable one, which form the worker's main means of subsistence, for example, if corn, that is wheat, replaces meat or potatoes are put in the place of wheat and rye, the level of the value of labor capacity naturally falls because the level of its needs has been pushed down. In our investigation, however, we shall everywhere assume that the amount and quantity of quality, that the amount and quality of the means of subsistence, and therefore also the extent of needs at a given level of civilization, is never pushed down because the investigation of the rise and fall of the level itself, particularly its artificial lowering, does not alter anything in the consideration of the general relationship. Among the Scots, for example, there are many families that live for whole months on oatmeal and barley meal mixed with only water and salt instead of on wheat and rye. And that very comfortably says Eden in the State of the Poor, 1797. That curious philanthropist and ennobled Yankee, Count Rumford, exerted his limited brain power at the end of the last century in the artificial creation of a low average. His essays, are a fine cookery book with recipes of all kinds of the cheapest possible grub for replacing the present normal food with surrogates for the workers. The cheapest meal which can be prepared, according to this philosopher, is a soup of barley, Indian corn, pepper, salt, vinegar, sweet herbs, and 4 herrings in 8 gallons of water. Yay. In the work cited above, Eden heartily recommends this pretty pig swill to workhouse overseers. 5 pounds of barley, 5 pounds of Indian corn, 3 pence worth of herring, a pence of salt, vinegar, pepper, and herbs, in all 20 3/4 provide a soup for 64 people, and given the average price of corn, it should be possible to reduce the cost per portion to 4. The mere workman who has only his arms in its industry has nothing unless he succeeds in selling his labor to others in every kind of work. It cannot fail to happen. It cannot fail to happen. And as a matter of fact, it does happen that the wages of the workman are limited to what is necessary to procure him his subsistence. Turgot, 1844, appears first 1766. Close quote. It is possible, on the one hand, to bring down the level of the value of labor capacity by reducing the value of the means of subsistence, or the way needs are satisfied through replacing better by cheaper and inferior provisions, or in general through reducing the scope, the volume of provisions. But in view of the fact that the nourishment of women and children enters into the determination of the level, the average level, it is also possible, on the other hand, to push down this level by forcing them to work. Children are already made use of for work during the time when they should be developing. But we are leaving this case out of consideration, like all other cases affecting the level of the value of labor. We are therefore giving capital a fair chance by assuming precisely its greatest abominations to be non-existent, ceteris paribus. The level can be equally be lowered by reducing the period of apprenticeship or its cost as near to zero as possible through simplification of work. The following passage from the Whig sycophant Macaulay can be adduced here in reference to the early exploitation of women as workers. It is characteristic of the kind of history writing and the kind of attitude in the economic sphere, too, which, while not being laudator temporis acti, limits its audacity to the retrospective, transferring it into the passive. Concerning child labor in factories, similar things in the 17th century, but the passage dealing with the historical process or the machine, etc., is better suited for it. See the Factory Reports of 1856. It was naturally of the highest importance for grasping the capital relation to determine the value of labor capacity, since the capital relation rests on the sale of that capacity. What had above all to be established was the way in which the value of this commodity is determined. For the essential feature of the relation is that labor capacity is offered as a commodity, but as a commodity, the determination of its exchange value is still the decisive factor. Since the exchange value of labor capacity is determined by the values or the prices of the means of subsistence, the use values necessary for labor capacity's preservation and reproduction, the physiocrats were able to form, on the whole, a correct conception of its value. However little they grasp the nature of value in general. Hence, this wage of labor, which is determined by the average necessities of life, plays an important role with these people who established the first rational conceptions of capital in general. In his anonymously published work, A Critical Dissertation on the Nature, Measures, and Causes of Value, etc., 1825, directed against Ricardo's theory of value altogether, Bailey remarks as follows on the former's determination of the value of labor capacity. Quote, Mr. Ricardo, ingeniously enough, avoids a difficulty which on the first view threatens to encumber his doctrine, that value depends on the quantity of labor employed in production. If this principle is rigidly adhered to, it follows that the value of labor depends on the quantity of labor employed in producing it, which is evidently absurd. By a dexterous turn, therefore, Mr. Ricardo makes the value of labor depend on the quantity of labor required to produce wages, or to give him the benefit of his own language, he maintains that the value of labor is to be estimated by the quantity of labor required to produce wages, by which he means the quantity of labor required to produce the money or commodities given to the laborer. This is similar to saving, that the value of cloth is to be estimated not by the quantity of labor bestowed upon its production, but by the quantity of labor bestowed on the production of the silver for which the cloth is exchanged. Close quote. The only right thing about this polemic is that Ricardo, as the capitalist, used his money to buy labor directly instead of disposition over labor capacity. Labor, as such, is not directly a commodity, for this is necessarily objectified labor working up in a use value. Ricardo does not distinguish between labor capacity as a commodity the worker sells, use value, which has a definite exchange value, and labor, which is merely the use of this capacity in octu. He is therefore incapable, leaving aside the contradiction picked out by Bailey, that living labor cannot be estimated by the quantity of labor employed in its production, of demonstrating how surplus value can emerge, namely the inequality between the quantity of labor the capitalist gives to the worker as a wage, and the quantity of living labor the capitalist buys for this amount of objectified labor. For the rest, Bailey's remark is silly. The price of cloth does not indeed consist also of the price of the cotton yarn consumed in it, just as the price of labor capacity consists of the means of subsistence that enter into it through the metabolic process. Incidentally, the reproduction of living organic things does not depend on the labor directly applied to the labor worked up in them, but on the means of subsistence they consume. And this is the way of reproducing them. Bailey could also have seen this in the determination of animals' value, even in the case of machines, insofar as coal, oil, and other matières instrumentales consumed by them enter into their cost, to the extent that labor is not restricted merely to the maintaining of life, the need being rather for a special kind of labor, which directly modifies labor capacity itself, develops it in such a way that it can practice a particular skill. This too enters into the value of labor, as is the case with more complex labor. And here it is directly incorporated in the worker, is labor expended to produce him. Otherwise, Bailey's joke only has the upshot that the labor applied to the reproduction of the organic body is applied to its means of subsistence, not directly to the body itself, since the appropriation of those means of subsistence through consumption is not work, but rather enjoyment. The necessities of life are renewed daily. If we take, for example, the mass of necessities of life that are required during a year for the worker to be able to live as a worker and maintain himself as a labor capacity, and the exchange value of this sum, i.e., the quantity of labor time that is worked up, objectified, contained in these means of subsistence, the total quantity of the means of subsistence the worker requires on the average in a day, taking one day with another, and the value of the same needed to live the whole year through, represent the value of his labor capacity on each day, or the quantity of the means of subsistence required on one day, so that this labor capacity may continue to exist, be reproduced as living labor capacity. Some of the means of subsistence are consumed more quickly, others more slowly. For example, the use values that serve daily as sustenance are also consumed daily, and the same is true of the use values that serve for heating, soap, cleanliness, and lighting. Other necessary means of subsistence, in contrast, such as clothes or housing, are worn out more slowly, although they are used and needed every day. Some means of subsistence must be bought afresh every day, replaced or renewed every day. Others, like, for example, clothes, need replacing or renewing only at longer intervals, although they have to be used every day. This is because they continue to serve as use values for longer periods of time and only become worn out, unserviceable at the end of these periods. If the total amount of the work of the means of subsistence the worker must consume every day in order to live as a worker equals A in 365 days, it equals 365A. In contrast to this, if the total amount of all the other means of subsistence he needs, which only need replacing, i.e., buying a new 3 times a year, equals B, he would only need 3B in the whole year. Taking them together, he would need 365A plus 3B in a year, and every day, 365A plus 3B divided by 365. The sum, that is, 365A plus 3B sum over 365 divided by. This would be the average amount of the means of subsistence he needed every day, and the value of this amount would be the daily value of his labor capacity, i.e., the value required day by day, counting one day as equivalent or another to buy the means of subsistence necessary for the maintenance of his labor capacity. It's made even easier in prisons, I suppose. There's an entire thing in this bracket that talks about labor capacity and value at the end. And I don't know if you want me to talk about dollars, but daily necessities of life, if computed as $1, would necessitate another set of estimations. So I will pursue this. You can read this for yourself, but this is the way in which you can estimate price of this, labor capacity. So we get to the end, and yes, I got to the end sort of on time, and other things must come forward. But what we've been reading here in this last little bit is from the Marxist economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63, the original. This is section 1, the transformation of money into capital, and describes the valorization process. So the valorization is, of course, this self-valorizing thing, particularly if you're from the point of view of the worker, is the value of the labor capacity, minimum salary, or average wage of labor. And all this seems also rational when, in fact, that it isn't necessarily. So we shall return to the meeting.